Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Simone here. Today I wanted to make a video all about historical fiction, which is a genre that I'm trying to read more of, especially since watching Emily from Novelle Novels and Julie from Hungry Bookworms channels. Both of those girls are like obsessed with historical fiction. They absolutely love it, and every time I watch a video of theirs it makes me want to pick up more. I have read quite a few and I wanted to talk about some I've read. Some I've liked, some I've not, but most of them I've liked. So I wanted to kind of talk about historical fiction that I have read. Now, I'm obviously not going to talk about every historical fiction I've read, or even nearly all of it, because I have read quite a bit over my time. But yes, I wanted to start with talking about Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. This is a book about geishas in Japan, who are essentially women who are trained up from a very young age to entertain. Basically, they are performers essentially. And before I started reading this book, I had actually seen the movie, and I, if I'm honest, was under the impression that a geisha was essentially a Japanese prostitute, which is very much the common misconception, and that is not the case at all. They often entertain the men in those areas, and they're paid to do so. However, although there sometimes is a sexual element, that is definitely not the main point, and that's definitely not the case all the time. The geishas are really kind of intelligent women who have lots and lots of preparation before they go, and it's such a wonderful story. I really enjoyed it. The only thing that, now looking back on it, I'm not 100% sure of is how true to life this story is, because Arthur Golden is obviously a white man and he does not necessarily have the kind of knowledge of what that is actually, what that would be like. So I'm not 100% sure how like real true to life this is, but it's definitely something that I would love to read more about. And if you have a Own Voices kind of book about geishas that you know about, definitely let me know, because I'd love to read that. So yeah, definitely something that I'm interested in. Next up we have The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This is quite a popular book as well. This one is set in World War II, and this follows Liesel is taken to a foster family when her parents are taken to a concentration camp, and she has a new family essentially. So she ends up living with a German family, and it's kind of about that. She doesn't know how to read, and her foster father teaches her to read, even though books are essentially, all of the books being burned because they're not allowed to read certain things. And it's just a really wonderful story, and she ends up, books are kind of her sort of salvation, I guess. The only thing I didn't love about this book, because I ended up giving this one a 3-star rather than anything higher, the main reason I didn't love this book was because it's told from the perspective of death, and I felt like that just drew me out of the story a little bit, and I didn't feel quite as connected to it as I did the movie. I really loved the movie, so I would recommend, if you don't like the book, to watch the movie, because it is really wonderful. But yeah, it's again about World War II, which is one of my favourite times to read about. So yeah, very much an enjoyable historical fiction. The next one is actually one of my favourite books of all time, and this was definitely my favourite book of the year when I read it in 2016, I believe I read this, and that is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This again is a story set in World War II, but this one follows two sisters, both of them dealing with the war in a very different way. One of them is very heavily against the war and is trying to she is very much wanting to join the resistance, and you know, very much against the idea of just sitting back and kind of letting it happen. The other one is much more conservative. She has 2 young children, so she's very much looking after them, and her husband is in a concentration camp, so she essentially is living at home, and one of the SS officers ends up coming to stay and forcing her to let him stay in her house, and it's kind of about that. So lots and lots of things happen. I really enjoyed this book. It's so wonderfully told, and the story about sisters is wonderful. This is definitely the historical fiction for me. This one was fantastic. I absolutely loved it, and if you haven't already read it, that is definitely the one from this video that you need to go and read, like right now. I really want to read some more Kristen Hanna, because I've only read that one of hers, and I think I'm going to enjoy her writing quite a lot. Number 4 is Between Shades of Grey by Rites. I only read this year, it was a few months ago now, and again it was about World War II. This takes place from a young girl's perspective. Lena is a 15-year-old Lithuanian girl, and in 1941 her younger brother and her mum are dragged from their house onto a train and essentially taken to Siberia, where they are forced to work and they have to like dig for food and stuff under really horrible conditions. The sad thing about this book is it's actually based on a true story, so it's really difficult to read and knowing that that's the case. This book is set over quite a number of years. In fact, it's quite a long time after the war ends that this book ends. It is really difficult to read. It can be a little bit difficult reading from such a young narrator, especially with some of the horrendous things that happened, but sometimes that kind of made it even more difficult to read, knowing that this is such a young voice telling such a horrendous story. So yeah, definitely a book again that I would recommend, and I do want to read again more Rites in the future as well, because she has quite a few historical fiction books as far as I know. Next up is one of my favourite classics of all time, and that is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This takes place in the 30s in Alabama in America, and this basically follows the story of a black man who has been accused of the murder of 2 white men who raped his young daughter. And it's about race relations in that time. Obviously in the 30s there was a lot of negativity towards black people, and Atticus Finch, who is one of the main characters, is the father of the 2 main characters, Scout and Jem. Atticus Finch is a lawyer, a white man, who has decided to take on the case. It's kind of about that. It's really, really wonderful. Again, there is the courtroom element to it, which, as you all know, I really, really enjoy. But I think for me, the reason that this was such a successful book was just because of the way it was written. I think it's always, again, interesting to hear from a sort of a child's perspective, but I just enjoyed the kind of sense of like honesty and like truthfulness in this. And yeah, I think it's a wonderful historical fiction. It's not quite so much as historical fiction. If you haven't really read too much historical fiction and you're a bit nervous about it, this is definitely a great book though, and I 100% would recommend that you pick it up. I would really love to reread this at some point because I did love it so much the first time around. Number 6 is The Help by Catherine Stockett. This is again a kind of book that's predominantly about race and about the relationship between black and white people in the American South. This follows a woman named Skeeter, who is a white woman who basically she lives in a community where it's very well to do, and her mum is kind of very well off, and she's friends with a lot of well off people, and basically it's a community where there are a lot of rich white men and women who employ black maids, and basically they make the black women look after their children and clean their houses and cook for them. And then it follows Skeeter, who decides that she's going to interview the hired help basically of her contemporaries, should we say, and she's going to write a book about it because she's a journalist. And she then spends time talking to Minnie and talking to Aibileen, who are some of the or 2 of the black women, and they tell their stories, and it's kind of about that relationship and also about the things that happen. It talks a lot about like the segregation. So a lot of the things are that many of the black women in the houses have their own toilet because the white rich women think that they're gonna contaminate them basically, and yet they essentially fob their children off onto them to be looked after because, you know, but it's that juxtaposition, the thing that doesn't really make sense, the hypocritical nature of that. And yeah, it really talks about that in a really good way. This is quite a sad book to read as well, just knowing that this all happened, and it's really, really difficult. But yeah, definitely an important read for me, and again, a film that is fantastic. Number 7 is Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. I did really want to mention this one, even though I personally did not enjoy this book, because I know that a lot of people have. Burial Rites talks about the last female to be executed in Iceland. So this follows a woman who was involved in a murder, and she has essentially been told that a family in Iceland has to look after her or keep her basically until her execution date, and it kind of follows that. I didn't really enjoy the writing of this, and I found it really difficult to follow, but I know that a lot of people really enjoy this one and find it to be a really interesting read. So definitely something that if you especially if you really enjoy the Icelandic culture, this is probably definitely a great read for you. So yeah, something that I would say go into with caution, just because I personally didn't enjoy it, but also like I said, I think I'm in the minority with that opinion. So if you do like historical fiction and you feel like that's kind of sounds like something that you'll enjoy, you probably will. I've kind of lost track, so I think this is number 8, but I may possibly have done an extra one, but who knows. So the next one I have is A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. This is set in London in 1895, and this is the first book in, I believe, a trilogy. I've only actually read the first one though. This follows Gemma Doyle, who has been living in India for most of her childhood until her mother commits suicide when she's 16, and she is shipped off to a boarding school in London. She at the time when her mum committed suicide, she saw a kind of vision and saw what was going to happen before it happened, and now she essentially is having similar visions, and she is then trying to figure out what happens. And also there seems to be an Indian man who may have followed her from India, and he's kind of following her and watching her. And again, this was a wonderful book. It's also something that's very different than anything else I've mentioned in this video. There is kind of a little bit of like kind of fantasy into it, I guess, but I loved the kind of mixed fantasy and historical fiction together. I really enjoyed that. So I do think, again, this is a great story, and one that I think more people should be talking about. In at number 9 is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I don't know if this would have counted as a historical fiction when it was written, but it's definitely kind of got that now, I guess, because this was written in 1862, I believe, and it's set in 1832. So I'm not sure how much of that would really count as historical. I feel like historical is like 50 years before, but anyway. I'm going to talk about it anyway because it's definitely historical for now. So most people will probably know what Les Miserables is about, but it basically follows a man named Jean Valjean who has just come out of prison after he stole a loaf of bread, and he was in prison for a really long time. He ends up essentially involved in the uprising in Paris, and he's also being followed by a policeman named Javert who knows who he is because he basically escaped, and knows who he is and is trying to bring him back down again. And this is wonderful. This has so many different I mean, this is a long book. This is 1200 pages, I think it is, and it took me ages to read, but I was very, very proud of myself when I did finish reading it. It does go off at tangents at times, but I still really enjoyed it myself, and I do think that you'll probably really enjoy this if you like the kind of classic style of writing. Like I said, this one is huge, so I would not recommend that you read this sort of as a light and fluffy read, shall we say, but it is definitely a classic, and it does feel great that I've read it, and I feel really good about that. And then the final one that I wanted to talk about is Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. This book was written in 1935, but it's set in 1820, and this follows a young girl named Mary Yellen who, when her mother dies, goes to stay with her aunt and her aunt's husband, so what she now calls her uncle, and she basically goes to stay at a place named Jamaica Inn. Now on her way there, the coachman tries to dissuade her from going because of all the negativity around the Jamaica Inn, and when she gets there she finds that her aunt, who used to be this vivacious, bubbly character, has completely changed and is essentially completely downbeaten by her uncle Joss Merlin, who is essentially owns the Jamaica Inn. Then it has lots of other elements to it. It's very gothic, it's very classic, and I really enjoyed this. I think that Daphne du Maurier has a wonderful way of writing that just makes you want to keep reading. She describes the background in such a wonderful way, and I definitely think this, although I slightly preferred Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, I would say that Jamaica Inn is a very, very close second, because I absolutely love this one so much. And if you haven't read Daphne du Maurier before, I would absolutely urge you to go and do so. I can't wait to read another Daphne du Maurier soon. So yeah, that is my 10, possibly 11, because like I said, I'm not sure how many I did in the end, historical fiction books that I have read, some of which I love, some of which I didn't, but most of which I did love. My video shout out for this video is going to be the wonderful Charlie from Charlie Brook. I obviously mention Charlie all the time, but like I said, I made a little list of all the people I've mentioned and I hadn't put her on the list yet, so I'm going to do a little shout out for her because Charlie is such a wonderful, wonderful person. She's so thoughtful. She will watch like every one of my videos and comment on it. I know how supportive she is to me and to a lot of other people. Charlie has such a wonderful demeanour, and I just love everything about her, honestly. I don't know what I would do without Charlie in my life now, to be honest with you. We've met in person now, so I'm really excited about that. So hopefully I'll be seeing her again in September. And yeah, I love Charlie, and I urge you to go and watch her channel if you haven't already. She's just delightful. So go and send her some love, guys. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and let me know what your favourite or least favourite historical fiction is. Or do you read historical fiction? Do you not? Let me know all of that down below, and I will see you in the next one, another video. Bye guys.